The house looked clean, smelled clean, and even passed inspections. Then the buyers moved in and discovered a problem that nobody had mentioned. I'm going to show you how these problems are generally handled here in California, so the next time you're buying or selling a home, you can go in prepared. The way our general California purchase agreement is written is that the condition that the property is in when the buyer submits the offer is the expectation of the condition it should be in when the property closes and the buyer gets the keys. So things like the yard being perfectly manicured when the buyer writes the offer, and then 45 days later at closing, it's overgrown. Those are situations where the seller is responsible to maintain that yard and keep it in the same condition that it was in. This is the same thing if the seller is moving out and they bump furniture and put holes in the walls. Those are also expected to be fixed because when the buyer walked through the property and wrote the offer, those holes did not exist. They were not buying the property with those holes. They were buying them with the expectation there would be no holes in the walls, which makes sense because that's exactly why a seller can't just start ripping out appliances and countertops and cabinets and taking all of the expensive items with them after the buyer writes the offer. In a previous video, I talked about there being roaches in a house at closing. If the seller was moving their furniture out and they noticed roaches, that's something the seller needs to remedy before closing or at least before the buyer moves in. Now, if the buyers just had bad luck and there were actually no roaches until the day of closing, now it's the buyer's responsibility because it was never like that when the seller lived there. But if it's a clear indication that this was a problem and the seller probably knew about it during the move out process, then that would technically fall on the seller's responsibility. However, as a buyer, if you can't prove that, it's going to be really hard to get the seller to compensate you or fix any problem. So just understand that if it is a condition that existed while the seller lived there and they didn't disclose it, or it wasn't obviously known, that is something they would be responsible to fix. However, if they did disclose it, or it was something that happened after they closed on the property and were no longer the owner, then the buyer is just out of luck.